clergyman went to see somebody in the hospital. Old lady was sort of ailing and so on, and he went to her and he said, how are you feeling today? And she said to him, I'm feeling honored and blessed and also grateful. So I'll start off my talk today by saying, first of all, I feel like the old lady. I'm honored that I think it was Quentin that phoned me the first time, and then Brian followed up afterwards. And we had lovely chats on the phone. Grateful I am, for the simple reason that at the age of 86, I'm now meeting a Finkelstein family that I heard about many times, but never ever met them.
Let's give a clap to them.
So, let's start off with the name Finkelstein. What does it mean? If you really analyze the word, it's actually German. And the word Stein in German means a stone. And the word Finkel is obviously the same as the Afrikaans Funkel. So it's a sparkling stone. And that is a diamond.
Yes, yes.
There's no other stone that we know of that in fact sparkles, and that's a diamond. So all of you sitting around here are actually diamonds. And because a diamond, when it's polished, has many faces, each of those facets reflects light in a different way. And that is why when I think of the Finkelstein family as a whole, then I start seeing some relationships. For example, you realize that there are 6 pharmacists that I know of in our family. I'm one, Philip is another, that's 2. We have a Jack Finkelstein who passed on, who had Central Pharmacy in Neisner, and we had his brother, Philip, who was also the mayor of Neisner at one stage, and he had the other pharmacy called Fiveys Pharmacy. And Jack had 2 children, one of which was a son called David. And when Jack died, David took over the practice, and he married a girl from Port Elizabeth. His father was a doctor, Leslie Solomon, and she is now Leslie Finkelstein. So there's another 4 pharmacists from Neisner, and Philip and myself. So there's 6 pharmacists. You'll also be interested to know that there are at least 3 dentists in the family. We know of Quentin, my second cousin who lives in Australia, Judah, and his son took over his practice in Sydney, Australia. So there are 3 dentists. There's also radiologists or radiographers in the family too. My wife is one, my daughter, elder daughter is one, and I believe one of your
My dad.
Your dad.
My dad
He
qualified
did
as a
radiography as well.
as a radiographer.
We have 3 radiographers in the family. But what I'm trying to show you is that that generation that came afterwards was like that diamond. Many, many facets of, I forgot the nursing side. The mother to start with, and then I believe also
Wendy.
His wife, she a midwife.
Wendy was a midwife.
And he was a midwife.
Patricia is a nursing
Oh,
sister.
there we go.
And Lorraine, don't forget Lorraine, please.
There we go. So we have 4 nursing sisters. Well, I thought I would get a 2 count today.
Sorry, Nate, can I add that my son is a doctor in Canada and his wife is a doctor of pharmacy.
Oh,
And
there
they
we go.
really find both.
There we go. Well, you know, I hate this idea of a doctor because in English, we can never distinguish whether it is a medical doctor or whether he is a PhD. And Afrikaans is so called that way. Because a doctor that is an ordinary GP is spelled with a small d en hy's 'n dokter met 'n ER. Maar dokter met 'n hoofletter D is a person who holds a doctor.
One
So
step ahead of
Afrikaans
it.
is far more expressive in distinguishing between doctors. But let me not digress. We have a family with a lot of talent and I think the opportunities of what occurred in the 20th century. Whereas the people from whom we came with very little. And I'm going to go back now historically, just to explain to you a little bit more about the Jewish settlement in South Africa. Unbeknown to many people, there were Jews already who came to South Africa with Van Riebeeck working for the Dutch East India Company. But they couldn't work for the Dutch East India Company because they were Jewish. So they became Protestants. And they changed their religion in order to retain their jobs. So you find a man like A.B. de Pas, who was very instrumental in getting the first synagogue built in Cape Town. Must have been of Dutch extraction with the name de Pas. But A.B. tells you there's no question about what his background is. But the first really known Jewish families to come to South Africa came with the 1820s. There were three Jewish families who came there with the Nortons, the Nordens, and the Slomans. Now, the only one I'm going to talk about is Benjamin Norden. Benjamin Norden lived in Grahamstown, and you may remember the Market Square. There's a house there called the Cock House. Andre Piet Brink, the writer, lived in that house when I was teaching at Rhodes University. But that original house was actually owned by Benjamin Norden. He was a very successful businessman, and in point of fact, Benjamin Norden came to Cape Town and he tried to convince a couple of Jewish people who had settled here to create a community. And that's how the Cape Town synagogue was built, the very first one, not that big fancy one in the gardens. That was the second synagogue that was built in 1905. The first one is the Klipgebou right next door. It's a stone building, and that was started in 1841. Because the first congregation started in the old Hemsley Hotel, and that was way back in the 1800s. So, when I think of my own hometown where I grew up, in Beaufort West, the first Jewish people that moved to Beaufort West were either British Jewish or German Jewish. And then suddenly the big influx came from Eastern Europe around about 1800s, late 1800s, 1880. And these people were running away from the Russian army, because anybody who was a male was drafted into the Russian army. And they thought, no, we're not going to fight for the Russians, we are getting out of here. And that is when Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe came. And they only chose one of two countries. Either they went to the United States and they were detained at Ellis Island, or they came to South Africa. And those who came to South Africa, they in fact, many of them walked from Cape Town to the Platteland. Oudtshoorn, Uniondale, Beaufort West, you name it. Some of them they came here penniless. They didn't have, the only thing they had, most of them were really traders and people who had a sort of trade. They were tailors, shoemakers, that type of thing. And that is how the first itinerant peddlers moved into the plotland. And I can tell you that I have it from two grandfathers. Both of them were traders, peddlers. I think the Afrikaans word is much nicer. Smoos. That's what they were. They smoosed in the platteland and they visited the farms and they would carry all the items that, the farmers couldn't get to the towns or whatever to buy things. So they came with their cart and horse and they had items that the people wanted. And many a times it was not even done in exchange of money. It was a sort of bartering game. Gee vir my 'n pond vere en ek gee vir jou goed van my wa. That's the way they did it. And it was a smoking trade. My grandfather came on my paternal side, settled in Oudtshoorn. And at one stage, Oudtshoorn was referred to as the Little Jerusalem. At one stage, Oudtshoorn had 3 synagogues. That's how big they were. And the old synagogue in St. John Street was demolished in my time. And the Ark is now sitting in the C.P. Nell Museum. So if you ever go into Oudtshoorn, visit that. That ark is a reproduction of one of the most beautiful arks from Russia. It's a reproduction virtually, brick by brick. And it was re-erected in the C.P. Nell Museum. The C.P. Nell Museum used to be the boys' high school in Oudtshoorn, and that's where my father was educated. But it now is a museum. And the only synagogue that has survived is the one, it used to be called Queen Street, it's now Baron van Rede van Oudtshoornstraat. That is still surviving. Oudtshoorn has virtually got a very poor Jewish community now. I don't even think they managed to get a corn in the synagogue on the Sabbath. That's how they've been ontvolken from the plotting. That's what's happened. And it's sad because those Jewish peddlers have played such an important role in economics in the plotting. Many of them own stores, many of them own hotels or whatever. And eventually the commerce of the town revolved around them. And many of the small towns actually acknowledge that. You go to Grafenet, for example, you'll see there's a lovely little plaque which recognized the sluices that used to come to the town. Go to Aberdeen, you'll see something similar. So these people played a role in the commerce of the town itself. And that, I think, I just need to give you the background sketch of what brought Jewish people to South Africa. Later on, a lot of other Jews moved, and why did they go? They went to the Oud-Transvaal. Why? Because there was gold, and there was diamonds that were discovered and so on. But the initial guys all hung around in the Cape. And that's how I got to know that there is a Finkelstein family that hailed from Joburg. I tried to see whether there were a link or not. But most of our Finkelstein are Oudtshoorn people. That's where it started. Now, let's get back to the specifics. When Quentin phoned me and he said to me, "What do you know about my family?" I said to him, "I can only tell you what I remember as a young lad." My first introduction to your side of the family was when my father used to come down to Muizenberg every year for a holiday. And one year he said to me, "As we go through Philippines, I want to stop at the poultry farm." I said, "But why, Dad?" "No, the man who owns that is a Finkelstein." And I remember the name of the poultry farm was called Fulmina Poultry Farm. And Fulmina was obviously the Philip's name, your grandfather, father, whatever it may be. And he then married Davin, who was first name. So the two names put together. And when we went there, remember I was a young boy, I knew very little. And then my father told me that this young Finkelstein was a bit of a reprobate, he was a bit of a maverick, he couldn't quite settle down, and eventually he landed up in Cape Town working for the railway. That he told me. So what you're hearing now is what I remember as a young lad when my dad told me. And he knew him very well, and possibly I think they may have even played as young boys, because this Philip must have been growing up in Oudtshoorn when he came there. I don't know exactly how he fitted into the family or whether, but I learned something very interesting today, that actually he came into the country that there is no trace of him. And that was probably how the ship's captain must have been told, bring this guy in and we will look after him in South Africa. So I don't know who actually fetched him off the ship or how he got, but he got to Oudtshoorn.
He was an undercover agent.
Well, anyhow, a little man gesmokkeld. Somehow or other he came in. But obviously he sired a whole lot of children too, and that's what you see there. The second incident that I remember as a young lad is a very nice looking man one day walked into my dad's business in West, and he said to him, Jack, he said, I'm also Finkelstein. He said, really? What's your name? He said, Richard Finkelstein. And he was working for Olivetti.
There's Richard's son over there. Put up there.
Was that Richard's son?
Yes.
Well, now I'll tell you. Now I remembered your dad. So then my father immediately phoned my mother and said, we've got a relative here. He's coming to dinner tonight. And that's how we met him for the first time. I remember him, a nice looking man, dark black hair, and I was just a youngster at that time. Years later, through the UCA, Derek Roel says to me one day, he says, I know a Finkelstein from Port Elizabeth. I said, really? What was his name? He said, Richard Finkelstein. So I said, did he work with? Yes, he worked with me at Olivetti. So when I was in Grahamstown, at Rhodes University, then Richard was in Port Elizabeth. And somehow or other we never got together, but that is what I actually remember. When I served on the South African Nursing Council, then I came across Sister Fingers. And then I realized that there was another part of the, well, I call it the missing tribe, because I didn't know much about this family other than what I was taught or told. And one day when I finished my master's degree in Glasgow and came back to South Africa, and I was on my way to be appointed as a senior lecturer at Rhodes University, we had a year. So I didn't want to take our furniture and stuff out of storage, and my wife's grandmother says, I've got a cottage in Muizenberg that is standing vacant and it's only used by the family, during the season. So you guys can move in there, and when you're ready to go to Grahamstown, then you can go. The reason I'm telling you that story because just along the road from us in Muizenberg, on the hill there was a Colonel Lombard. Now, Colonel Lombard was the officer commanding at Easterplaat Air Force base. He used to fly the Shackletons, and that's what he was part of the Coastal Command. En hy sê, man, ek het 'n man daar met die naam van Finkelstein wat vir my werk, hy is Sergeant Finkelstein. Is nie familie van jou nie? Hy sê, ja, nee, ek verstaan. Ek weet ons het daai naam. Maar hy sê, ek kan nie verstaan, die man is dan Nederduits gereformeerde kerk. Ek sê, ja man, maar ek dink, sy oupa was seker dood gewees. Want die Finkelstein kan nie in Afrikaans. Even although I grew up right living next to the pastorie in Beaufort West, and we had the dominee right next door to us. And of course, as his sons were the naughtiest buggers that you'd ever come across, and we were great mates. And I saw all the dominees come and go in the town, so I knew. In fact, ek het kateksasie klas gedoen saam met hulle. My father said to me, ek kan nog nie belydenis opsê. And that's how we grew up, as part of that community. And it was quite amazing, but here was now another Finkelstein that was important.
That was my father in Easterplant.
It's Easterplant, there you go. So that was your father. There we go.
He was the oldest son.
He was the eldest of the sons. So that, now you can see all I have is these sort of boyhood memories of a family that I've never ever met. And it was so great for me to come at the invitation of Frank and also his brother to in fact come to chat to you. I didn't want to bore you with a long involved story, but it is a story that I can tell you from my childhood days, and it's a story that sort of links the families together. When Quentin phoned me, I thought to myself it might not be a bad idea to phone my second cousin, because he is a second cousin to me. His father, Charlie, was in Oudtshoorn. He had a business there, and he only had one brother, Louis. Louis ran the butchery in Oudtshoorn. And evidently Charlie knew about Philip. So I thought to myself, I'll give Judah a ring and say, does he know anything more than what I can remember about? And sadly, he didn't. But Judah is now over 90. And he was, as I say, he practiced as a dentist in Rondebosch before he emigrated to Australia. And his son has now taken over the practice. But he couldn't put anything more to it than that. But all I can say to you is keep on looking. Somewhere or other we are going to find the missing link. And I'm sure that it's there. Look, I learned more about my family going to the archives and digging out those old documents. And I never knew about my grandfather on my father's side. That Finkelstein I knew nothing about. He died at the age of 46. And my father didn't even know his own father, because he was, I think, a year or year and a half old when his father died. So he was brought up by his mother. So basically there was very little known of that sort of family and so on. My father had a lot of brothers and a sister. And one brother had a bar in Wales Street called the Governor's Bar, 68 Wales Street. That was his brother David. And then his other brother decided that South Africa wasn't for him, and he went to seek his fortune in the old Rhodesia. So Ben went to Rhodesia, and he had a son and two daughters. So the only one who carries the Finkelstein name would be that son. And he only had one son. And one day somebody told me about the Finkelstein who was farming in Nelspruit, Bruce Finkelstein. He is 81. So eventually I could pinpoint who he was and who his father was, but that was from the Rhodesian crowd. And so eventually eventually, you know, these people start popping up, or descendants of them pop up, and one has just got to sort of ask around. But I learned a lot going to the archives, and I must just end with this little story. I got hold of my grandfather's testament, and believe it or not, it was written in Netherlands. So I've still got it, and I read through it, and the person who was in fact the executor of that will was a man by the name of Nachum Sanders. Now, Nachum Sanders was actually married to a Finkelstein. So I assumed that this Nachum Sanders must have married my grandfather's sister. And the reason for I'm saying that is you wouldn't appoint a stranger as executor of your will. So I assume that this Nachum Sanders was the actual brother-in-law of my late grandfather. And years later, I come to Cape Town and I bump into a dentist by the name of Frederick Nathan Saunders. And Saunders, this Saunders, that was his grandfather. And he is now buried in Cornwall North, and grandmother. So there is a Saunders link.
Yeah,
Also,
I said that Saunders brought my father out when he was 8 years old.
very odd. You see, that's what happened. The families used to bring the people out, and they just absorbed them in the family. And that, I think,
And we
is
had
what.
a Dr. Saunders in Joburg, and
Yeah,
he was
yeah.
related to the
Now Fred Saunders, the grandson, was actually a dentist. But he gave up dentistry and he went to work for the South African Medical Journal. And he used to write up the continuing education for the SAMJ. So he got out of that completely, out of dentistry. But he had a practice in Seaport in the early days. But I want to get back to my grandfather's will that I started telling you about. This Saunders was the executor. And they were very meticulous. Written in longhand was a full inventory of what my grandfather possessed. And he had two little farms in an area called Armut in the early days. Now Armut changed its name to Formut. And if you drive from Oudtshoorn to Calitzdorp, I went with my father one day and he said, I want to show you something. So I said, you know, we always came up with some surprise or other. So we started driving, and we drove from Oudtshoorn, then we came to Armut, what was then Armut, now Formut, then you come to Jan Voorheeskraal, and then you come to Wynandsrivier. And after Wynandsrivier, you get to Calitzdorp. So the old man said to me, I'm going to take you now to the river, and I'll show you that where the cold water is running right next to it. The water is boiling out of the river. And that's where they established the warm butt there at Calitzdorp. In the good old days when I went with my father, there were just some reeds that they packed together to make like a screen. And the people used to go and swim there. Now they've got a fancy structure there and everything. But in the early days, I remember going with my dad. It was very, very rudimentary and crude. But other than the two farms that my grandfather had, there was a pound of white ostrich feathers in the estate, and there was also a horse and cart. And Saunders wrote to the Master of the Supreme Court in Cape Town, and he said to him, Dear sir, I am the executor of this will. May I have your permission to sell the horse? Because I feel the hele estate of niks oor. So please, can I sell the horse? And in that document, I've got it, is that they gave him permission to sell the horse. So then they could sort things out. So there it is. Don't forget we have a wonderful archive. It used to be the old Roland Street trunk, but it's now the archive. And it's amazing what documents you find there. And as I say, death certificates, marriage certificates of old things and so on, you'll find it there. And it's quite interesting, but it takes a lot of hard work to sit there for hours and try and figure it all out.
And
But
then it's the point of view. You gotta find out where we come from. What's
Well,
the doing? It's not our job.
Yeah, it's your job, not my job. I've done my job. And all I haven't got documentary evidence, I'm just relying on memory to tell you what happened. But if there are any other questions, please feel free.
I'm going to ask you one,
Yes.
just to share with them what you shared with me on the phone, that you went to culturally today, and there you found Philip.
Yes, we actually found him working at what was then known as the Salt River Works. And there they used to fix the trains and the coaches and so on. But I believe that he had a trade as a wholesaler or upholsterer. So I think that all those trains of upholstery that was done, and those of you whose memories go back to the SAR and H, you will remember those trains were all done in green, and they could sort of flap down three things and you could sleep in 3 levels on the train in the early days.
Now that
Can I
is
ask you a question? Why do you say we Finkelsteins and not Finkelsteins?
You ask a very interesting question. Somebody asked me the other day, are you Finkelstein or Finkelstein? I said, look, it depends whether you went to Cambridge or Oxford. Mark this out. But if you really want to pronounce it correctly, it's a German way. It's Finkelstein. Because Stein is a stone, as I explained to you. And you know, the stone comes into many surnames. Many people anglicize, and don't think that Finkelstein wasn't anglicized. There are Finns, there are Steins, there are Finkels, and there's one that's very British, Finlayson. They were Finkelsteins before.
But maybe if you
That's
take
right.
Finkelstein means falling star. Finkelstein means rolling stone. Am I correct?
No, Finkel is the shine.
But Finkelstein is
Stein.
falling star in Hebrew. In Israel, I've been to Israel twice, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of Finkelsteins in Israel.
Yes, there are a lot.
Right? And they told me that I'm actually a Finkelstein, not a Finkelstein.
No. Well, you see, to me, the Stein is really the German, and it refers to the stone. And the stone comes from biblical times. And that is where Jacob was sleeping with his head on a stone. And he had that dream with the ladder and the angels coming up and down and all. So it became, you see how many names end in Stein. Rubenstein, Liechtenstein, you know them, there are plenty that end Rubenstein, Einstein, and it was a biblical thing that their name had to have a biblical injunction in it. And that's, I think, where the Stein came in.
So you say we are from German descent.
No, the name has a German connotation. Because again, due to politics, a lot of people think that Lithuania, Latvia and so on were Russian. It wasn't. At one stage, Lithuania belonged to Poland. And then only afterwards there was the Russian Federation that grouped them all together. So Lithuania only became a sovereign state in the 1920s or 30s, there around. That is why, although we can claim Lithuanian passport, you cannot claim it if your parents or grandparents left the country before 1926 when they became independent. You then had to apply to Poland because they were part of Poland in the early days. So it was quite a business.
I just have another question.
Sure.
The Ashkenazi Jews, they
Yes.
lived in Germany, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they wouldn't have said Finkelstein.
Finkelstein,
They would have
always.
said Finkelstein.
Like I say, Rubinstein. They always used to, Einstein. Always used to emphasize that. Of course, even in the wines, you have a Stein and a Steen. Those are two varieties, but there's no difference between a Steen and a Stein. They're the same.
Just
Same
to come back to
grape
your story,
variety. Yeah.
you made an interesting statement when your partner and stuff went to social work.
Yeah.
He said, "What is a Jew doing here?"
Well, that was
Who said that?
it was one of the guys there. Who said, what is a Finkelstein doing in the sort of works? It wasn't heard of, you know. Jewish people were in business or smoking or doing something like that. They couldn't be working for the railways. That was just not. It did.
You know the Finkelsteins in Houston?
I was aware of the family Finkelstein in Europe. I don't know who. I have no idea what the relationship is there. But as I say, the Cape Finkelsteins are totally. We can all trace our genealogy virtually to Oetzel. Whereas the Joburg Finkelstein, I remember the late Professor Seftel always said to me, "Do you know Oscar Finkelstein?" You know, old Harry used to be really rough and ready. And Harry said to me, "Oscar Finkelstein." I said, "No, I don't know him." "No, but he's got the same name as you have." I said, "But it must be one of the guys who moved to the old Transvaal in the early days." But it was not from my family. My family all definitely were Oetzel.
So sorry, so where did we actually come from?
Me.
Latvia?
Well, my grandfather came from a little town called Kelm in Lithuania.
No, the Finkelstein.
That's Finkelstein.
The one that your grandfather.
I would
He came
imagine
from
he
there?
came from the same town.
Didn't he come with a sister? I heard he came with a sister.
Yes, sir. I think he does what you have.
My father always told us that he came, and my mother told me he came from Latvia.
I also thought he came from,
And
well, they
also,
came
a
from
lot of
there.
us were told we came from
Yeah.
Latvia. That's why.
Yeah, remember Latvia and Lithuania
They're
sitting
right
right next
next
to
to
each
each
other.
Yeah.
It could have, mentioned that, I don't know. It was quite funny when a lot of these Jewish blokes came to London or the United Kingdom, and many of them fled over by foot. They did the trip right from Lithuania or Latvia, they went to London. Sometimes they went by train or they went by ship, and they landed in London. So a lot of the Jews who came to South Africa came via London. And many times those blokes couldn't spell those long Polish names with C's and Z's and whatnot in it. So I remember when I was doing my MSc in Glasgow, I went to the synagogue there in Glasgow and I sat next to a guy. And I said, we get chatting. I said, "What's your surname?" He said, "Burns." I said, "Oh, hi, Burns. And I know the poet Robbie Burns. Where the hell does a nice Jewish boy like you come with the name of Burns?" He said, "No, it wasn't so. When my father or grandfather came out here, the custom official said to him, 'What's your surname?' He said, 'Bernitsky.' He said, 'I can't spell it, you Burns.'" They wrote him. So many of the names changed as a result of some clerical error on and particularly in the United Kingdom, when they came by. My wife's family happened to be Stein, but they became Stone when they came to South Africa. Oh, grandfather, which she'll verify.
This, I'm
Yeah,
a
for
lady
me.
Ross, and she told me a story about Finkelstein. She worked for a company of attorneys, I can't remember the attorneys or accountants in Scotland. And they were Finkelsteins. And she met, no, she was going to meet somebody on the Queen Mary that she used to work for. And she said to me, you might know them because they're Finkelstein. So I said, no. I said, I don't know anybody Finkelstein at all. So she said, well, I'm going to meet them, and they're coming on the Queen Mary, they're coming to visit family in South Africa, in Mons. And they call themselves Finlayson.
There you go, that's what I said. That's
And
where
that
they
famous-
anglicised the name.
Yeah, and
That Finlayson runs a
Finlayson-
wine farm
Yeah.
in the Hemelnade Vallei.
Yeah, that Bouchard Finlayson
That's it.
wine
That's
farm
what
is
I'm
that Finlayson is actually originally a Finkelstein.
We knew about that. And I think I said to you that, you know, people changed names, shortened them, changed it. I just stuck with it all the years and it didn't bother me.
No.
But there were lots of people the one we had, also there was a radiological practice in Cape Town, Finlayson and Clegg. That was a brother to the guy who had the wine farm. Yeah, he was a radiologist. Yeah.
There's a story that Neil Diamond's name was actually Finkelstein.
It could
And
be.
he changed it to
Well, there you go. I rest my case.
Well, that was very interesting.
Well, there you go.
It's fascinating.
From now on, we're going to designate Nate as a scholar
And a gentleman.
and a patriot. Waiting it out this long to give his talk and speech. So now we're all going to go
No,
and
hold
strengthen
on,
the
excuse
inner
me,
man.
Excuse me, the management is actually accommodating us by bringing the dessert here because we're out of time to go back there.
Oh,
So he's coming.
Even better.
Yeah.
even better.
Thank you. I've got a very good friend that I know, Stray Spine.
Yeah.
Very Afrikaans, here in the